You black people always think you deserve everything handed to you on a silver platter, don't you? My father-in-law Robert's words cut through the silence in the room like a sharp blade. I was standing next to the mahogany table where I had just signed the documents renouncing the $3 million family inheritance. My wife Jennifer remained silent, her eyes fixed on the floor, avoiding my gaze. "Dad, please," she murmured, but Robert raised his hand, silencing her. "No, daughter. It's time we told the truth. Terrence was never worthy of this family." He approached me, his chest puffed out with arrogance. "You may have fooled my daughter with your charms, but I always knew who you really were. My name is Terrence Williams, I'm 34 years old, and I just found out that 15 years of marriage and 2 children weren't enough to secure me a place in my wife's family. At least not in the eyes of patriarch Robert Henderson, a 68-year-old businessman who built a real estate empire in Atlanta and never missed an opportunity to remind me where I came from." The family meeting had been called to discuss the distribution of the recently deceased grandfather Henderson's estate. $3 million to be divided among the grandchildren and their spouses. But when my turn came, Robert placed those papers in front of me, a generous offer of $50,000 in exchange for my complete renunciation of any claim to the family fortune. "It's this or nothing," he said, banging his finger on the table. "And considering where you came from, you should be grateful." Jennifer remained silent throughout the humiliation. The woman who swore to love me in joy and in sorrow didn't say a word as her father treated me like an intruder in my own family. Our children, Marcus, 12, and Sophia, 9, were at their maternal grandparents' house, unaware that their future was being decided in that room. I signed the papers. Not because I agreed, but because I had already made a decision that would change everything. 3 weeks earlier, Robert had made a fatal mistake. He asked me to clean out the basement of the house where we lived, the property we inherited when Grandpa Henderson died. "There are some old things down there that need to be thrown out," he said casually. What he didn't know was that by cleaning that basement, I would discover something that would completely change the game. A metal box hidden behind the old boiler, containing documents that would prove not only the extent of the Henderson family's systematic racism, but also secrets that could destroy Robert's empire overnight. As I walked out of the Henderson mansion on that cold October afternoon, with $50,000 in my pocket and a bitter taste in my mouth, Robert shouted after me, "And don't you dare come back. This family has already been too generous to you." I got into my car and smiled for the first time in weeks. If this story is touching your heart, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, because you'll want to follow every detail of what happened next. Robert Henderson thought he had humiliated me for the last time. He had no idea that by forcing me to clean that basement, he had given me the weapons for a war he never saw coming. 15 years. 15 years of forced smiles, veiled comments, and humiliations disguised as family jokes. As I drove down Interstate 75 that night, every word Robert had said echoed in my mind like a hammer striking hot metal. The first time Robert showed his true colors was 3 days after my wedding to Jennifer. We were all gathered for post-honeymoon brunch when he leaned over and whispered in my ear, "I hope you know you're joining a family with very high standards, young man." The word young man came out of his mouth like poison disguised as honey. Robert Henderson wasn't just a successful businessman. He was a man who had built his fortune by buying properties in predominantly black neighborhoods for rock-bottom prices, evicting the families, and reselling to white buyers for 3 times the value. He called it urban revitalization. I called it predatory gentrification. All these years, Jennifer remained silent when her father made his comments. "Terrence has a different mindset about money," he would say at family gatherings. "People like him don't understand long-term investments." Or, "It's impressive how well he can express himself, considering his background." Each sentence was calculated to belittle me without appearing overtly racist. Robert was too smart to use words that could be recorded or repeated. He preferred the slow poison of constant microaggression, the kind of prejudice that corrodes the soul drop by drop. The turning point came 3 weeks before the inheritance meeting. Robert had asked me to clean out the basement of the house where we lived, a property that technically belonged to us, but which he always treated as if it were still his. "There are some old documents and furniture that need to be thrown out," he said. "You can handle that, can't you?" What Robert didn't know was that I had grown up as the son of an archivist. My mother worked at the National Archives in Atlanta, and she taught me from an early age that old documents often contain the most valuable secrets. "Never throw anything away before examining it carefully," she always said. That's how I found the metal box hidden behind the old boiler. Inside was a collection of documents that would make any prosecutor salivate. Fraudulent purchase contracts, correspondence with city officials discussing methods to discourage certain types of residents, and photographs of meetings that Robert swore he had never attended. But what shocked me most were the letters. Dozens of handwritten letters between Robert and his late father, Henry Henderson, dating back to the 1990s. A detailed conversation about maintaining the racial purity of the neighborhoods they were developing. Henry wrote in a 1994 letter, "The trick is not to prevent them from buying. It's to make sure they can't stay." One of the strategies described in detail was controlled integration, allowing a few successful black families to move into Henderson developments, but only those who could be managed through social and financial pressure. It was a cruel game where families like mine were used as tokens to mask systematic discrimination. The letter that struck me the most was from 1998, a year before Jennifer and I started dating. Robert wrote to his father, "Jennifer is dating a black boy from school. Smart, well-educated, stable family. Could be an interesting opportunity. If they marry, we will have someone on the inside to monitor and, if necessary, control." My marriage had not only been accepted by Robert. It had been planned by him. That night, after signing the waiver papers, I came home and found Jennifer in the living room, pretending to watch television. Our children were upstairs doing their homework, oblivious to the fact that their financial future had just been sabotaged. "How was the meeting?" Jennifer asked without taking her eyes off the screen. "Your father offered $50,000 in exchange for my complete waiver of inheritance rights." "And you accepted?" This time she looked at me, and I saw something in her eyes that I had never noticed before. Relief. "I signed the papers." Jennifer sighed and turned her attention back to the television. "It's probably best for everyone." It was at that moment that I realized my wife was not just a passive spectator to her father's humiliations. She was an accomplice. During 15 years of marriage, Jennifer had watched her father treat me like an intruder in my own family, and not once, not even once, had she ever defended me. Later that night, while Jennifer slept, I went down to the basement and opened the metal box again. There were more documents I hadn't yet examined thoroughly. Financial records showing that Robert had used federal funds intended for low-income housing to finance his own luxury projects. Cassette tape recordings of telephone conversations where he discussed methods for sabotaging bids from black contractors. And then I found the folder labeled Terrence Project, 1999 to 2024. 25 years of meticulous documentation about my life. Reports from private investigators, copies of my academic and financial records, even photographs of places I frequented. Robert hadn't just accepted my marriage to his daughter. He had orchestrated 2.5 decades of surveillance. The folder contained annual assessments of my usefulness to the Henderson family business. In 2010, when I helped expand the family real estate business into new markets, I was rated highly valuable. In 2018, when I questioned some questionable ethical practices, my rating changed to potential problem. The final entry, dated 2 weeks before the inheritance meeting, simply read, "The time has come for the final separation. The asset has become a liability." I was not Robert Henderson's son-in-law. I was an investment project that had lost its usefulness. Sitting in that cold basement, surrounded by evidence of a manipulation that had lasted most of my adult life, I felt something I had never experienced before. It wasn't anger. Anger was too simple for what I was feeling. It was a crystal clear, almost surgical clarity about exactly what needed to be done. Robert Henderson had spent 25 years meticulously documenting his own destruction. And he had just handed the evidence right to me. As I organized the documents in chronological order, I began making some phone calls. The first was to Marcus Johnson, a civil rights attorney who specialized in housing discrimination cases. The second was to a private investigator my mother had recommended years ago. The third was to an investigative reporter at the Atlanta Journal-Constitution whom I knew from college. Each call was carefully planned. Each word was chosen with precision. Because Robert Henderson had taught me something valuable during all those years of humiliation, sometimes the best revenge is simply to give people enough rope to hang themselves. And he had just handed me the whole rope, with detailed instructions on how to tie the knot. The next morning, I woke up with a strange feeling. For the first time in 15 years, I didn't feel the familiar weight of discomfort when I thought about the Henderson family. Robert thought he had broken me the night before. In reality, he had set me free. But he didn't know yet that the war had begun. And when he found out, it would be too late to defend himself. 3 days after discovering the Terrence Project folder, I woke up to find Jennifer in the kitchen, wearing that silk robe I had bought her for her 35th birthday. She was making coffee, moving with the mechanical efficiency of someone who had been performing a routine for decades. But there was something different about her movements that morning, a stiffness that hadn't been there the week before. "I need to tell you something," she said without turning around. I sat down at the table where we had so often planned our children's future, where Marcus had blown out the candles on his last birthday, where Sophia drew her comic strips on Saturday afternoons. The same table where Jennifer now placed a cup of coffee in front of me with the delicacy of someone serving poison. "Dad wants you to move out of the house." The words came out of her mouth as naturally as if she were commenting on the weather. There was no preparation, no context, not even a hint of apology. Just pure and simple information, delivered as if it were a corporate memo. "The house where our children grew up?" I asked, keeping my voice under control. "The house that supposedly belongs to us?" Jennifer finally turned around, and I saw something in her eyes that made my stomach churn. It wasn't discomfort or embarrassment. It was relief. As if she could finally stop pretending we were a team. "It's not personal, Terrence. It's simply a practical matter. Dad needs the property for a new development project, and it's not personal." The words echoed in the kitchen like an echo of all the microaggressions I had swallowed for 15 years. "Our family being kicked out of our own home is not personal. You're overreacting." Jennifer crossed her arms, assuming the defensive posture I knew so well. "Dad is offering generous compensation. We can find another place." It was at that moment that I realized something that should have been obvious years ago. Jennifer wasn't just a passive bystander to her father's prejudices. She wasn't just complicit. She was an active participant. Every silence during the humiliations, every change of subject when I tried to discuss Robert's behavior, every "don't be dramatic" when I questioned racist comments, none of it was to keep the peace in the family. It was to maintain the status quo that benefited the Henderson family at my expense. That night, while Jennifer watched television in the living room as if she hadn't just blown up our family life, I went down to the basement to review more documents from the metal box. There was an envelope I hadn't opened yet, marked emergency, open only if necessary. Inside, I found something that completely changed my understanding of the situation. A series of fake sales contracts, dated 3 years ago, transferring ownership of our house from my and Jennifer's joint name to a subsidiary of the Henderson business. My signature was perfectly forged on each document. According to these papers, I had voluntarily sold my share of the house to my wife's family for a symbolic $1. But what shocked me most was a handwritten note in the margin of one of the contracts, in handwriting I recognized as Jennifer's. "Never suspects anything. Process completed as agreed with Dad." My wife had actively participated in forging documents to steal the house where our children lived. That morning, I made a few more calls. The first was to David Chun, a forensic accountant I had met during my years working in commercial insurance. David specialized in uncovering financial fraud, and when I briefly explained the situation, his reaction was immediate. "Terrence, this isn't just family discrimination. It's large-scale document fraud. If you have evidence of what you're telling me, we're talking about federal charges." The second call was to Dr. Angela Thompson, a psychologist specializing in family manipulation and narcissistic abuse. I had found her name through an online search on behavior patterns in dysfunctional families. During our 40-minute conversation, she mapped out what had happened to me over the past 15 years. "What you're describing is a classic pattern of isolation and systematic control," she explained. "They didn't just want to exclude you from the inheritance. They wanted to break you psychologically first, so that when the moment of final exclusion came, you would already be conditioned to accept it passively." The third call was the hardest. I called my mother, Dorothy Williams, who had been living in Detroit since my father died 5 years ago. When I told her about the inheritance, the house, and the forged documents, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. "Son," she finally said, her voice laden with a sadness that broke my heart, "I tried to warn you about this family years ago. Remember when I said there was something strange about the way they treated you? That it seemed too theatrical to be genuine?" I remembered. During the first year of my marriage, My mother had made subtle comments about how the Henderson family seemed to be studying my behavior during family gatherings. At the time, I had interpreted her concerns as the paranoia of an overprotective mother. Now I realized that Dorothy Williams had identified in weeks what had taken me 15 years to understand. Mom, I need to tell you something. I found documents that prove they've been monitoring me for decades. Private investigators, annual reports on my usefulness to the family business. Jennifer knew everything. The silence that followed was different from before. It was the silence of a woman who had raised a child alone after losing her husband, who had worked double shifts to pay for my education, who had taught me that dignity was not something you begged from others, it was something you maintained regardless of how they treated you. Terrence, her voice now had the firmness I remembered from when she taught me important lessons during my childhood. Sometimes in life, people try to break you because they know that, whole, you pose a threat to them. The question is not whether they succeeded in hurting you. The question is what you will do now that you know the truth. It was during that conversation with my mother that I made my final decision. It wouldn't just be a matter of exposure or revenge. It would be a matter of systematic justice. Robert Henderson had built an empire through predatory discrimination. Jennifer had chosen to be an accomplice to long-term psychological manipulation. And together, they had tried to reduce me to a disposable pawn in their power games. But they had made one fundamental mistake. They had meticulously documented every crime, every manipulation, every act of discrimination. And now, all that documentation was in my hands. The next morning, Marcus knocked on the door of my makeshift office in the basement. My 12-year-old son rarely came down there, preferring the video games in his bedroom or the basketball court in the backyard. But that day, he sat down in the old chair next to my desk and asked me a question that changed everything. Dad, why does Grandpa Robert always talk differently when you leave the room? My blood ran cold. What do you mean, son? Well, Marcus looked at his hands, clearly uncomfortable. When you go to get something from the kitchen during dinner, or when you leave to answer the phone, he changes. He makes jokes about you that aren't funny. And everyone feels a little awkward, but no one says anything. What kind of jokes, Marcus? About how you talk, about your clothes, about why Mom married you. Marcus looked up at me, and I saw in his eyes a maturity that number 12-year-old should have. Dad, I don't understand much about these things, but sometimes it seems like he doesn't like people like you very much. People like you. My 12-year-old son had identified the racism in his mother's family more clearly than I had in 15 years of marriage. Marcus, have you told your mother this? I tried once. She said I was overreacting and that Grandpa Robert just had a different sense of humor. Marcus looked down at his hands again. But Dad, it didn't seem like a joke. It seemed like he wanted to hurt you, only you weren't there to hear it. That afternoon, after Marcus went upstairs to do his homework, I picked up my phone and sent a message to Marcus Johnson, the civil rights attorney specializing in discrimination. I need to schedule an urgent meeting. And bring a tape recorder. It will be necessary. The reply came 15 minutes later, Thursday, 10 a.m., my office. And Terrence? From what you told me yesterday, this case could be much bigger than we imagined. As I organized all the documents in the metal box in chronological order, creating a complete archive of 25 years of systematic manipulation, Jennifer shouted from upstairs that dinner was ready. Her voice had the same mechanical tone as always, as if she hadn't just informed me that we were being evicted from our own home. I went upstairs, kissed my children, sat down at the family table, and ate dinner in silence. Jennifer made superficial comments about work, asked about Marcus' plans for the next basketball game, helped Sophia with a crossword puzzle from the newspaper. The perfect facade of the happy American family. But this time, I was watching it all with completely different eyes. Jennifer's every gesture, every carefully chosen word, every smile that didn't reach her eyes, none of it was confusing or painful anymore. It was simply additional evidence of a performance that had lasted more than half my adult life. After dinner, when the kids went up to their rooms and Jennifer settled in front of the television, I went back to the basement and opened my laptop. It was time to turn 25 years of documented manipulation into something the Henderson family never saw coming. It wouldn't just be exposure. It wouldn't just be revenge. It would be a complete restructuring of power in their lives, conducted with the same meticulous precision they had used to try to destroy me. Robert Henderson had taught me some valuable lessons during all those years of humiliation. The main one was that proper documentation is the difference between accusations and evidence. And now, I had all the evidence I needed. The war had officially begun. And this time, I wouldn't just be a victim watching my own destruction. I would be the architect of a justice that neither Robert nor Jennifer would ever forget. The meeting with Marcus Johnson took place on a rainy Thursday in downtown Atlanta. His office was on the 23rd floor of a glass building that reflected the heavy clouds like liquid mirrors. Marcus was a 45-year-old black man, bald, with eyes that seemed to have seen every kind of injustice the American system could produce. "Terrence," he said, leafing through the documents I had organized in chronological order, "in my 20-year career, I have never seen such meticulous documentation of systematic discrimination. It's as if they wanted to be caught." He spread out on his desk the fraudulent contracts, the handwritten letters between Robert and his father, the annual reports on my family's usefulness. Each document was a piece of a puzzle that, when put together, formed a complete picture of a decades-long conspiracy. "The Terrence Project folder alone is enough for federal charges," Marcus continued, adjusting his reading glasses. "But these letters between Robert and Henry Henderson from the 1990s, this is evidence of systematic housing discrimination. We're talking about violations of the Fair Housing Act that haven't even expired." Over the next 3 hours, we built what Marcus called a controlled implosion strategy. It wouldn't just be a civil lawsuit against the Henderson family. It would be a coordinated attack on multiple fronts, each designed to methodically dismantle the empire Robert had built through discriminatory practices. "First," Marcus explained, drawing a diagram on the whiteboard in his office, "we send copies of these documents to the Department of Housing and Urban Development. Housing discrimination is one of the things the federal government takes most seriously. Second, we contact the Georgia Attorney General. Large-scale document fraud, especially involving real estate, is a serious state crime. Third," he smiled for the first time since we began the meeting, "we file a civil suit for emotional distress, fraud, invasion of privacy, and family discrimination. With this documentation, we're talking millions in compensation." But what impressed me most was the fourth part of Marcus's strategy. We're going public. Newspapers, radio, television. The Henderson family built their reputation by being seen as pillars of the community. When these letters become public, especially the parts about maintaining racial purity in their developments, the social destruction will be complete. I left Marcus's office with a folder full of forms to sign and a feeling I hadn't experienced in months. It wasn't just hope, it was the cold, calculated certainty of someone who finally had the right tools for the job. That same afternoon, I made a phone call that I knew would be crucial. Dr. Margaret Foster was a forensic psychiatrist who specialized in cases of long-term family manipulation. Marcus had given me her contact information, explaining that we would need a professional assessment of the psychological damage to strengthen our case. "Terrence," Dr. Foster said after I briefly explained the situation, "what you are describing is a classic pattern of what we call systematic psychological abuse by proxy. Your wife was used as an instrument of control, but that does not absolve her of responsibility for choosing to actively participate." During our 2-hour session, Dr. Foster mapped out each phase of the manipulation I had suffered. The Henderson family's controlled integration, the 25 years of surveillance, the fabrication of documents, the exclusion from inheritance, the forced eviction, all of it followed a specific psychological pattern. "The goal wasn't just to exclude you," she explained, taking notes in her pad. "It was to systematically break your self-esteem, so that when the moment of final exclusion came, you would passively accept it as if it were deserved." But while I was building my legal and psychological strategy, Robert was becoming bolder in his cruelty. The week after I renounced my inheritance, he showed up at our house for the first time in months. "I've come to collect some things that belong to the family," he said, pushing open the front door as if he owned the place. Jennifer was at work, the children at school. It was just Robert and me, face to face, for the first time since the humiliation at his mansion. "What kind of things?" I asked, keeping my voice neutral. "Some antiques my father left here when you moved out. Paintings, silverware, some pieces of furniture." Robert walked around the room like an invader cataloging treasures. "Now that you've renounced your family rights, these items should go back to the rightful family." I followed Robert around the house as he marked items with yellow tags. The oak clock that belonged to Grandpa Henderson. The set of china Jennifer had inherited. Even some family photos in which I appeared were marked for later removal. You know, Terence, Robert said, stopping in front of the wedding portrait of Jennifer and me that hung above the fireplace, I've always admired your ability to adapt. The way you managed to fit into such an established family. He pronounced the word established with the same venom he always used for words like traditional or respectable, when referring to the Henderson family as opposed to my background. Of course, he continued, placing a yellow label on the corner of our wedding portrait, all adaptation has its natural limits. The time has come for you to return to where you truly belong. It was at that moment that I realized something crucial about Robert Henderson. All his cruelty, all his need to humiliate me, did not come from a position of power. It came from fear. Fear that I represented something that threatened the carefully controlled world he had built. All these years, Robert hadn't just tolerated me because I was married to his daughter. He had studied me, documented me, monitored me, not to control me, but to convince himself that he could control me. The Terence Project folder wasn't evidence of power. It was evidence of obsession. That night, after Robert left carrying 3 boxes of family antiques, I went down to the basement and opened the metal box again. There was an envelope I hadn't yet fully examined, marked Final Contingency, 2024. Inside, I found something that completely changed my strategy. A will. Not the official will of Grandfather Henderson that had been read at the family meeting, but an earlier document, dated 6 months before his death. In this will, Grandfather Henderson had left very specific instructions about the distribution of his estate. To my granddaughter Jennifer and her husband Terence Williams, the document read, I leave the Maple Street property and an education fund of $500,000 for their children, Marcus and Sophia Henderson Williams. The children's full names in the original will included Henderson Williams. Grandfather had not only included me in the inheritance, he had formally recognized that my children were part of the Henderson lineage. But there was more. A handwritten note from Grandfather, attached to the will. Robert, I know you have reservations about Terence, but he is a good man who makes my granddaughter happy. I hope you learn to accept that our family is not made stronger by excluding people, but by including those who demonstrate character. Robert had hidden this will and forged another to exclude me completely from the inheritance. It wasn't just discrimination, it was forgery of a federal legal document, inheritance fraud, and embezzlement. The next morning, I took the original will to Marcus Johnson. When he finished reading it, he was silent for almost 5 minutes. Terence, he finally said, this is no longer just a case of discrimination. This is criminal fraud on a grand scale. Robert Henderson didn't just violate your civil rights, he stole an inheritance that legally belonged to his children. We spent the rest of the morning reworking our strategy. With the original will, we were no longer just seeking compensation for discrimination. We were recovering stolen property and demanding criminal accountability. We need more evidence about how Robert managed to hide this will, Marcus said. Someone at his law firm, or at the probate court, had to be an accomplice. That's when I remembered something Jennifer had mentioned casually months ago. Her cousin Derek worked at the law firm that had handled Grandpa Henderson's legal affairs. Derek Henderson, son of Robert's younger brother, had always been treated as the black sheep of the family for his liberal ideas. That afternoon, I called Derek. I hadn't seen him in 2 years, since a family barbecue where he had openly defended civil rights movements, causing general discomfort among the more conservative Hendersons. Derek, I need to meet with you. It's about your grandfather's estate, and I think you need to know some things about your Uncle Robert. Derek's response surprised me. Terence, I've been waiting for this call for months. Do you have any idea how long I've been waiting for someone to ask the right questions about this estate? We met Derek that same evening at a small cafe in downtown Atlanta. He arrived carrying a leather briefcase that I recognized as identical to the ones Robert always used for important documents. My grandfather gave me this 3 days before he died, Derek said, placing the briefcase on the table between us. He told me to keep it as insurance against unscrupulous ambition. At the time, I didn't understand what he meant. Inside the briefcase were copies of all the documents Robert had tried to hide. The original will, of course, but also audio recordings of conversations between Robert and the family lawyer discussing how to simplify the distribution of the inheritance. Uncle Robert paid the firm $20,000 to lose the original will, Derek explained. He said it would be easier for the family if the inheritance were distributed in a more traditional way. If you're following this journey of revelations and revenge, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, because the story is still going to take turns that even I didn't imagine possible at that moment. Derek, I asked, barely able to control my emotion, why didn't you ever say anything? Why did you keep these documents a secret? Because, he replied, his eyes shining with a determination I had never seen in any other member of the Henderson family. My grandfather made me promise that I would only reveal these documents if someone tried to use his death to perpetuate the kind of discrimination he spent his entire life trying to overcome. He knew Uncle Robert would do just that. I left that cafe that night with more than evidence. I had an ally within the Henderson family itself, someone who had been waiting years for the opportunity to challenge the empire of discrimination Robert had built. The next morning, Marcus Johnson called with news that completely changed our strategy. Terrence, remember those documents about housing discrimination you found? I just spoke with a contact at the FBI. They have an ongoing investigation into discriminatory practices in real estate development in the South. Your documentation may be the evidence they've been looking for to close the case. What does that mean? It means Robert Henderson could face federal charges. And when that happens, the entire national media will want to hear your story. As I hung up the phone, I looked out the basement window where it had all begun 3 weeks ago. Robert had forced me to clean that space, thinking he was giving me a humiliating task. In reality, he had given me the keys to completely destroy the world he had spent decades building. That afternoon, Marcus and Derek met in my basement to plan our final strategy. While they organized documents and recordings in chronological order, I made one last discovery in the metal box. A small leather-bound notebook with Grandpa Henderson's handwriting. It was a diary of the last months of his life, documenting his growing concern about what Robert was doing with the family business. May 15, 2023, Robert showed me the plans for the new development in East Atlanta. When I asked about affordable housing for local families, he laughed and said that certain people weren't the right kind of neighbors. I felt disgusted. June 3, 2023, I spoke with Terrence at the family barbecue. He is a man of integrity, intelligent, who clearly loves my granddaughter and great-grandchildren. Robert treats him with condescension disguised as courtesy. I need to take action. August 12, 2023, I changed my will today. Robert will never understand that strength comes from inclusion, not exclusion. Terrence and the children are Hendersons now, whether Robert likes it or not. The last entry was from a week before Grandpa's death. If anything happens to me, I hope Terrence knows that he has always been more of a son to me than Robert ever was. Some men build legacies of love. Others build empires of fear. I know exactly what kind of legacy I want to leave. I closed the notebook with tears in my eyes. Grandfather Henderson had seen through his own son's facade and had taken steps to protect our family. Robert had not only stolen our inheritance, he had betrayed his own father's final wishes. It was time to honor the memory of a good man and fully expose his son's corruption. The following Monday, Marcus filed 3 different legal actions simultaneously. The civil suit against Robert for inheritance fraud and discrimination. The criminal complaint for document forgery. And the federal complaint for systematic civil rights violations. In 48 hours, Robert Henderson's carefully constructed life would begin to unravel. And this time, I wouldn't just be a victim watching my own destruction. I would be the architect of a justice he never saw coming. The war had officially begun. And thanks to Robert's own obsessive documentation, I had all the weapons I needed to win. On Tuesday morning at 8:47 a.m., the plan went into action simultaneously on 3 different fronts. Marcus Johnson arrived at the Henderson and Associates law office with a federal subpoena. Derek was inside, waiting with all the digitized recordings. And I was sitting in the conference room of the State Attorney General's office, personally handing over 25 years of financial crime documentation to Attorney General James Mitchell. Mr. Williams, Mitchell said, leafing through the handwritten letters between Robert and his father, this isn't just family discrimination. It's a systematic pattern of federal crimes spanning decades. At 10:30 a.m., Jennifer called me, hysterical. Terrence, what have you done? The FBI is at Dad's office with search and seizure warrants. They're taking computers, files, everything. I did what I should have done 15 years ago, I replied calmly. I defended our family. Our family. She laughed, but it was a desperate laugh. You destroyed our family. Dad could go to prison. Jennifer, Your father forged documents to steal our children's inheritance. He conspired for 25 years to humiliate and control me. He committed federal crimes. I just handed over the evidence he himself documented." The silence on the other end of the line lasted almost a full minute. "You knew," she whispered finally. "You knew everything from the beginning." "No. I found out 3 weeks ago, when your father sent me to clean the basement. But Jennifer, the question isn't what I knew. It's why you chose to participate in humiliating the father of your children for 15 years. At 2 p.m., Robert showed up at my door. He was disheveled, his hair messy and his shirt wrinkled. His eyes had that wild look of someone who had just realized his whole world was falling apart. "You," he said, pointing his finger at me as if it were a gun. "You planned all this." "I didn't plan anything, Robert. I just organized the evidence of your own crimes chronologically and handed it over to the proper authorities." "Crimes?" He laughed, but it was the laugh of a man on the edge of sanity. "I gave you a family. I gave you a home. I gave you a life you could never have built on your own. You gave me a gilded prison where you humiliated me daily. And you meticulously documented every humiliation for 25 years. That's when I showed him a copy of the Terrence Project 1999 to 2024 folder. Robert turned pale when he saw his own surveillance project being used against him. "How did you?" "It was in your father's metal box, along with the real will where he included me in the inheritance and recognized Marcus and Sophia as Henderson Williams. Along with all his letters discussing how to maintain racial purity in his developments. My father was senile at the end. That will is worthless." The FBI disagrees. So does the Georgia Attorney General. And the Department of Housing and Urban Development. It was then that Robert realized the true extent of what was happening. "You contacted federal authorities?" "Robert, you violated the Fair Housing Act for decades. You forged inheritance documents. You forged my signature on property transfers. You organized illegal surveillance for 25 years. And you documented everything meticulously." His arrogance turned to pure panic. "No one will believe the words of a black man against a respected family like ours." "They're not my words, Robert. They're yours. Your handwritten letters, your recordings, your private investigator reports. You built your own condemnation, brick by brick, over a quarter of a century." At that moment, Derek appeared in the doorway behind his uncle. "Dad gave you a chance, Uncle Robert. He said to give me those documents only if you tried to perpetuate discrimination after his death. You chose to steal his great-grandchildren's inheritance on day one." Robert's expression when he saw his own nephew was one of utter betrayal. His last hope for family control had evaporated. "On Monday," I continued, "the Atlanta Journal-Constitution publishes the full investigation into discriminatory practices at Henderson and Associates. On Tuesday, the FBI finalizes the federal charges. And on Wednesday, Marcus files a $50 million civil suit." $50 million? 25 years of psychological damage, plus inheritance fraud, plus property misappropriation, plus systematic civil rights violations. Your own documents calculate the value of each crime. Robert leaned against the wall, finally realizing there was no way out. "What do you want from me?" "Nothing. You already gave me everything I needed when you forced me to clean that basement." As Robert staggered back to his car, Derek turned to me. "You know, Terrence, Grandpa always said you were the son he never had. Now I understand why." 2 days later, the front page of the Atlanta Journal-Constitution carried the headline, "Real Estate Empire Built Through Systematic Discrimination. Documents Reveal 30 Years of Racial Crimes." Robert Henderson's downfall had officially begun. And this time, there would be no turning back. 6 months later, I sat in the front row of the federal courtroom watching Robert Henderson be sentenced to 15 years in prison for inheritance fraud, systematic discrimination, and document forgery. His company was fined $12 million, and all developments built through discriminatory practices were transferred to a public housing fund. Jennifer filed for divorce a week after her father's arrest. "I can't pretend I didn't know anymore," she said, signing the joint custody papers. "You were always a better father than I was a mother." Marcus and Sophia moved in with me to a new house, purchased with part of the $8 million settlement we received in the civil lawsuit. Marcus asked me why I wasn't angry. Son, anger consumes those who feel it, not those who caused it. Dad chose justice. Derek took control of the remaining family businesses and implemented the affordable housing policies his grandfather had always dreamed of. Grandpa would be proud, he told me last Thanksgiving. You honored his legacy better than any Henderson. Dr. Foster told me that Marcus developed impressive self-esteem after witnessing how his father faced injustice with dignity. Sophia draws colorful families again. The biggest irony? Robert taught me that meticulous documentation is power. He spent 25 years documenting my supposed inferiority and ended up documenting his own criminality. Last Christmas, my mother Dorothy came from Detroit and brought an old photo of me and my father. He would be proud of how you protected your children, she said, hugging Marcus and Sophia. The lesson I learned was not about revenge, but about patient justice. Robert tried to break me, but he only taught me that dignity is not begged for, it is maintained. If this story of resilience and justice touched your heart, subscribe to the channel for more stories of people who turned humiliation into triumph. Today, Marcus plays basketball at the university on a full scholarship. Sophia wants to be a lawyer, like Daddy was brave. And me? I teach workshops on civil rights, using my story to show that sometimes the worst thing that happens to us takes us exactly where we need to be. Robert Henderson tried to erase our family from Henderson history. Instead, he ensured that our names would be remembered forever, for all the right reasons.